Reggae riffs collided against a rock and roll beat, then slammed into jazz rhythms in an ear-cringing torrent of noise across the waveless harbor. But the din didn't drown out dogs barking in the mangroves. He looked at Sharky, who was napping on the second-best cushion in the salon. How she and his humans managed to block out the dogs' racket was a mystery. When the dogs in the mangroves became quiet, others on the far side of town began to howl. Xander's ears flattened against his head as he tried to block out the musical din and focus on what they were saying to see if it held a hidden message, but no sooner had he started to focus than the dogs became quiet. After several minutes, the barking resumed even farther away. A moment later, the closer ones started barking again, but it sounded like barking for the sake of making noise, not to cover a coded message. Deep in thought about what the dog telegraph might mean to him, Xander opened his email. Simon had written an ingratiating thank you note to the Purrsident. The Tom certainly had a gift for twisting words, since he managed to give the impression that he, Xander, would be solely responsible for any unwanted outcome. The urge to hiss at the email expanded within his chest. He tore his attention from the infuriating letter and looked at Sharky. Unwilling to blow his cover, he inhaled a deep breath through his nose, held it for the count of 10, then blew the combined anger and air out through his mouth. He repeated the calming ritual twice before his sense of serenity overpowered the emotions Simon's message generated. Xander's tail thumped the cushion. If the Tom's only intention was to dump the blame, he probably would not have sent him a copy of the email. With that thought in mind, Xander sat down and read every word of the note, which announced that the clues were leading him northward. Xander switched to his map of Jamaica to look up the coordinates, which Simon listed as being the catnapper's last known destination, then selected a convenient location to meet Simon, then emailed him the coordinates and told him to get there as fast as possible. Xander doubted that dogs were dumb enough to stay at any specific location for several days, unless they were the bait in a trap. Xander keyed 1730, north 7647, west into his collar, did one last visual check of the map, then he smacked the ESC key, killing Simon's message. Sharky opened an eye. Something wrong. What could be wrong? It's nearly 3 in the morning and I can't get any sleep because one band is belting out jazz while the other two are now blaring that reggae stuff and at least 4 packs of dogs are howling. What on earth could be wrong? She yawned. So you're saying this isn't typical. The way she made it a statement instead of a question gave him pause. But it is for here? Absolutely. What a rather awful place. In that case, when does the music stop? She thought a moment. Generally when all the roosters start crowing. Dear Heather, he'd forgotten about the dozens of those off-key birds that either congratulated themselves for staying alive to meet the sun or sleeping through the clashing music from 3 bands. Have dogs and poultry taken over every part of Jamaica? Huh? Never mind. He doubted the dogs were capable enough, let alone smart enough to accomplish it anywhere. Whatever was going on in other areas of the island had to be better than Port Antonio, which was obviously a town devoted to puppy training. I guess I'd better get going. Where? He gave a slight shrug, listened to Mike snore for several moments, then said, it doesn't matter as long as it's quiet enough to sleep. Reluctantly, Sharky stretched. Ready whenever you are. Look, I really like your company, but you don't have to come with me. He tried to sound casual despite his relief at the idea of having her companionship. If she truly was a spy, she wouldn't be able to snoop while he was away, and if she wasn't, it could be handy to have someone as quiet as her around. Mon, Yegis Donna speak the lingo. He stared at her. What did you say? You don't speak the local dialect, that's what I said, but I said it in Padama, and your question verified why I must come. Xander's gaze narrowed. How come you speak Pa whatever? Her whiskers twitched. You really mean, why haven't I spoken to you in Padama? And that's simple, it's island lingo, you just arrived. Obviously you haven't had time to learn. He studied her, realizing for the umpteenth time that there was more to this little black and white gal than he'd first suspected. It was something he'd look into when Valentine's spying. Unfortunately, the mutt had just boarded and was eavesdropping outside the aft hatch. Did the fool mutt really think he couldn't hear his slobber splat against the deck? That he couldn't smell his rancid aroma? Xander snorted. What's wrong? Sharky asked. Nothing. Xander scratched his collar, which seemed heavier than usual. Her attention centered on the azure leather, her revulsion apparent. If her allegiance to Catamondo was certain and if Valentine hadn't been lurking nearby, he would have shown her how many things he could accomplish with the technology hidden in it. He tilted his head and looked at her. Assuming she was a spy, a demonstration might show her just how superior cats were so he could turn her into a double agent, but he wasn't fool enough to allow a dog to witness such power, no matter how tempting it was to impress a gal with the way Catamondo's best scientist had learned to alter collars, catnip mice, and other common items to be much more than what the humans managed to make. His ears flattened with irritation at the reminder of how many things he had to do to keep his people calmly ignorant of the truth. Cats had been so successful in training their servants that most humans were silly enough to believe they owned cats when everyone knew it was vice versa. He made certain the computer was exactly the way it had been when he'd sat down to work, hours before. In a perfect world, he wouldn't need to let them believe they'd chosen him. Of course, in a perfect world, his servants would never have done anything as radical as drug him on catnip, pop him into his carry crate and move him aboard a boat. And less than 2 weeks before the global election, the election in which he'd been the favorite to win North American Purrtector. Not that their deed had ended badly. After explaining why he needed to exclude his name from the ballot, the Purrsident had convened a special session of the Global Council. They had unanimously voted to create the position of Purrtector and appointed him as the first, no election involved. He wondered if the council had taken into account that 75% of the planet was flooded, which gave him a wider range of influence than any other feline, or if they figured that since there were so few cats per square mile of water, he had limited authority. If so, they'd overlooked the fact that he'd spent the past few years developing internet technology and writing instructions so every cat with access to a computer could communicate with anyone else at any time. Moving aboard Whispering Winds had actually added to his vast array of electronics, in large part due to his ability to integrate several technologies by using the ham radio. His nose wrinkled as he thought how poorly named the black plastic gizmo was and how strange humans were to name something that useful but inedible after a pig. Of course, humans always named things wrong. The black box reporters always spoke of on aircraft was actually bright orange. If they called someone slim, he generally waddled, and they continually referred to common sense when it was obviously the least common thing he'd ever seen in the human race. Something is really bad wrong, isn't it? Sharky's golden eyes appeared larger than usual, just thinking. He gave the cabin a final glance. Guess if I want to find some peace and see this country, we'd better get going before it gets too hot. He strolled toward the cockpit, as if he didn't have anything more pressing in mind than sightseeing. When she caught up with him on the steps to the cockpit, he asked, "What do you know about Kingston?" Whatever she intended to say was forgotten when Valentine stepped in front of them. "You can't leave the boat. Are you putting me under arrest or something?" "Not me," Valentine said ominously. "It's the law. Where's your badge?" Xander edged past him, making certain his fur didn't touch the mutt. "Buddy, I'm telling you this for your own good. No animals are allowed off boats. We're in quarantine. That means you're supposed to be on your boat, not mine. And I would be, if you didn't keep jumping ship." Great globs of slobber blossomed along his jowls. "What am I gonna do without you?" Sharky, who was in the process of circumventing a glob of fallen spittle, stumbled into the putrid mess. Leaping back, she muttered, "Those that lie down with dogs, get up with fleas." Valentine shot her a surprised look. Damned if the mutt wasn't a good actor. He almost believed the bit about his desire to protect his friend. Sharky straightened. "Is this dog a friend of yours?" Her tone sounded genuinely scathing. If he denied it, Valentine would watch him twice as hard, and if he didn't and Sharky wasn't a spy, she would have something to gossip about, or worse. "Sharky, this is Valentine. He lives aboard that boat." Giving his ear a disdainful slant, which dogs never understood, he pointed towards Sea Paws. "So you were being honest." Valentine sniffed Sharky, then gave a deep woof of laughter. "You dog, you." Xander's shivs inched out, ready to rip the rude dog's nose to shreds. Sharky's eyes narrowed as she divided her attention between them. "What are you talking about?" Xander demanded. A roaring woof of laughter splattered globs of spit in a vile wave. Xander hastily stepped out of the way. Sharky moved back into the salon and chose a spot where she could watch both of them, but not get involved or contaminated. You said you were up that tree with a shark, and you weren't lying. Valentine looked like he'd just given the punchline to the best joke in the world, but he was the only one laughing. Those Blackfoot sure did have it right, Sharky grumbled. What Blackfoot? He asked. You couldn't possibly understand. She defiantly raised her chin. Acting as if he was totally disgusted, Xander went back down the ladder. Sharky kept her attention on the wall when he sat next to her. Sorry, he said, I should have warned you about that creep. She didn't twitch a hair. What did Blackfeet have right? Those that lie down with dogs, get up with fleas, she said in a flat tone, her attention centered on the other side of the cabin. And it's not Blackfeet, it's Blackfoot. Baffled by her response, he looked at the spot on the wall that held her attention. His humans had secured their framed copy of rules for non-pet owners who visit and like to complain about our cat to Whispering Wind's wall with enough Velcro to secure a dwarf. He'd ignored the foolish bit of antiqued paper since they'd installed it, but now wondered what Sharky found so enthralling, so he read over the 4 points. 1. He lives here. You don't. 2. If you don't want fur on your clothes, stay off the furniture. 3. I like my cat better than I like most people. 4. To you he's an animal. To us, he is a son, who is short, hairy, walks on all fours and is speech challenged. Xander winced at the last point. I know it's insulting, but I let them keep it up to humor them. You think it's insulting to have your people put up a notice to the world that you're more important than other two legs? Her yowl hit such a high note that Mike's rhythmic snores stopped. You have got to be the most self-centered guy I've ever met. What's this? Valentine asked from the cockpit, a lover's quarrel. No, they hissed as they turned in accord to glare at their common enemy. Valentine's eyes showed thick halos of white as they advanced in unison, then he fled. For a moment, the urge to pursue him nearly overrode his sense of duty. With difficulty, Xander controlled the instinct. Sharky, who wasn't as disciplined, vaulted up the stairs, landed on a cushion, which slid across the cockpit like a runaway toboggan. She pitched sideways, smacking her head against the wheel. He hurried onto the deck. Are you okay? She gave a short nod. Either she was still angry at him because of the stupid picture or she was too stubborn to admit getting hurt. He grabbed her head between his paws and checked her for injuries. You're going to be sore for a few days, he said, as he inspected her left ear, bruised but not broken. He sat down, waiting for her to say something, anything. The silence lengthened. He'd never met any female that could take silence, until now. Still want to go with me? She looked everywhere except at him. Fine. He stood up to leave. Why did you call their tribute to you insulting? He paused. I am not speech challenged, they are. So you think the whole thing is insulting just because they can't understand you? No, just the part about being speech challenged, which is always the last thing I read and stays foremost in my mind. She swallowed, her attention on the deck. Maybe if you didn't read the last part, you'd realize how lucky you are. She glanced at him, her eyes shimmering. I'd give anything if my people put up a sign that said I was more important than another two legs. Xander studied her as he digested what she had and had not said since he'd met her. You haven't lived here your entire life, have you? She stared at him, her eyes enormous with surprise. And I'm willing to bet that you've lived on a boat at some point, he added. How did you know? I wasn't totally certain until now. Her gaze narrowed. You don't step on the lines, for one thing. Only someone that knew how treacherous they could be would know to avoid them. She gulped. Is that the reason you're here? Did you step on a loose line and get pitched overboard? She shook her head. I don't want to talk about this. Not here. Not now. Maybe when I know you better. Her voice trailed off as if she couldn't imagine anyone knowing her that long. She wiped her paw across her eyes, then added, if you're still willing to have me, I'd like to come with you. Lead the way, he said in his normal voice, but as she moved past him, he whispered, dogs are watching and I want them to think we're going to Kingston. We need to ditch them and head for the Blue Mountains. Sharky gave an infinitesimal nod, then moved past as if he hadn't uttered a syllable. If the girl wasn't a spy, she was a credit to felinedom. Kingston is a rough place, she said as they walked down the dock. Rougher than here? He surreptitiously keyed 1811, north 7627, west, whispering Wynn's coordinates, into his collar. That's what I heard. Interesting. He dodged to his right, ducked under the stephanotis fragrant white blooms, then eased through the wrought iron fence. Sharky followed him, a baffled expression on her face. No need to make it easier for the mutts than I have to. An oh look flitted through her gaze, but he couldn't decide if she actually thought he was paranoid on the subject of canines, a possibility he'd mulled over on more than one occasion, or if she didn't fully understand how often a dog that appeared to be sound asleep was actually monitoring the movements of cats in his jurisdiction. According to his copy of Bartleby's history, opossum hunters had originally perfected the ability to hide in plain sight, and soon dogs of all types were lounging on porches and sidewalks all over the world as they spied on cats. It was an effective surveillance technique, one that Xander practiced at every opportunity, too. I suppose you want to scare that rooster, or something, so you have another excuse to climb another tree. You read my mind. Something few other cats ever managed to do. The only problem is that this time of night, we'd have to climb a tree to find one. Sharky might have the potential to be a protector. Perhaps even a top-notch one. If Simon proved to be nothing more than a translator for kitten stories and writer of inflammatory email, which was all Xander could be certain of after their correspondence, he might recommend Miss Sharky for the Jamaican protector position. It wasn't on the level of being a continental protector, but it was a place to start. Assuming she wasn't in league with the enemy, of course. Again, he wondered what the island's cats had been thinking about when they nominated a scribe to be their defender. Were Dame Esmeralda, Sharky, Simon and Scalpy, the rough fellow who he'd noticed in a previous kickboxing tournament, the only cats in Jamaica? You weren't serious about us crossing the mountains to Kingston, were you? Sharky lowered her tone to a whisper, then added, they aren't all asleep, after all. That said, she casually set off toward a big red rooster, which was scratching away at the rock-hard soil under a streetlight. He stopped her and motioned for her to simply climb the nearby tree. No need to make him have a fit this time of night, it would only call attention to us. He followed her up the tree to the first broad branch. Simon is meeting us at a coffee plantation in the Blue Mountains. Well, that's specific, she hissed. Just how do you expect to find him? I've heard those mountains are really mountains. I've never seen them, but I hear that they're much bigger than the hills around here. Though she was halfway out on a branch, which intersected with another tree, she stopped, turned to face him and sat down on the limb. Xander leapt over her and continued on without looking back. Either she got over whatever was bothering her, or not. He had a red claw situation to handle, and while meeting Simon at some farm in the mountains might be a waste of time, it got him away from Valentine, Port Antonio and its roving packs of dogs, and most importantly, it would appear to the Purrsident and council as if he was taking charge of the situation. Either way, he won. Now, all he had to do was get to the spot on Bowden Road at the appointed time. He studied the miserable excuse of potholed asphalt, which his GPS unit confirmed was where the highway should be. Without signs, there was no way to confirm it was the correct road. He couldn't believe any country would have a main highway in such sorry shape, much less that Bowden Road was Port Antonio's main access to the Blue Mountains. He frowned as he recalled reading that it followed the Rio Grande between the Blue Mountains and the John Crow Mountains. Since there was no river in sight, it probably meant the human-made map was incorrect. Still, his catonal GPS had never failed him, and it stated this asphalt mess was the correct road. Due to his confidence in Catamondo's technology, he hiked parallel with the road for 2 hours, but by the time dawn's rays illuminated his surroundings, the vegetation had changed from somewhat civil to virtually impenetrable. Worse, even though the dense foliage provided excellent opportunities to conceal himself while he checked for followers, it deterred forward progress. Clinging leaves combined with the humidity and increasingly vertical slopes made any progress extremely difficult. If he was late, the state of the island's infrastructure would provide a valid reason for whatever went wrong. He pressed on faster, then slipped downward. Xander's claws flashed out, grasping for a hold, but his slide increased to a blind plummet with damp leaves slapping his face and fur. Finally, one claw caught so hard he feared it would be yanked right out of his paw. He sank the other 4 claws into what felt like living wood, then maneuvered to find a purchase for his other paws. The only solid spot in the muddy, moldy mire seemed to be the narrow area his right index claw had found. Once both front paws were secure and he caught his breath, he heard the sound of small, unseen feet scampering through the leaves, the high cry of a bird, speaking in a twitter he'd never heard, and the sinister sound of water playing among the cobbles of a shoreline. Much as he hated to admit it, it was doubtful if he'd fallen victim to a trap laid by the dogs, something that would have been easier to deal with than one of Mother Nature's little geological surprises. Should he move left, right, or climb up the slimy root? He swayed sideways. The root started tearing. His only option became down. Not wanting to put off the inevitable until he was too tired to cope, he loosened his grip and plummeted through the thick, damp foliage. Abruptly he shot into the open, about 6 feet above the water, and realized he was about to fall into the widest river he'd ever seen. He quickly grasped another root. Years of training made his first reaction after avoiding disaster a calming breath, and his second a dispassionate assessment of his situation despite the strain on his claws and the dampness seeping through his fur. A raindrop smacked his nose. "Heather, what have I done to offend you?" Instead of an answer, cracks started ripping around his claws. He adjusted his grip, but new fissures formed within moments of his shivs sinking in each new spot. As he searched for a stable portion of the root, it started raining in earnest. He'd never angered the goddess this badly. He peered upward, but the slick bank and leaves did not provide any escape. Sideways wasn't an option. That only gave him one alternative: he could take it now, or after he was too exhausted to plan a proper landing. Xander retracted his claws and plummeted toward the water. His paws smacked first, then his tummy, and finally his chin. Then the water closed over him. He plunged several more feet, lungs burning, before contacting the rocky bottom. He leapt back toward the air. Moving through water seemed to take an eternity. Merlin frequently bragged about his daring feats in the water, so Xander knew moving through water with a strong current took longer. He just hadn't anticipated that he'd go deeper into river water than the ocean, which he'd become accustomed to. His head finally broke the surface. He gasped in a lungful of air, then coughed up a mouthful of rain. Gasping, he paddled the way Merlin had taught him. It was impossible to see across the river, so he concentrated on the vertical side close to him, looking for anything which could provide access to get back up the precipice. He marveled at the way so many trees had managed to hook their roots into the rock, but knew from his embarrassing fall that those roots only provided the illusion of a retreat. As the water propelled him downstream, he tried to swim across the river, but no matter how hard he paddled, he never seemed to get any further from where the cliff softened into a hillside. Finally, nearing exhaustion, he kicked toward a nearby rocky bank. It seemed like it took forever before he felt smooth stone beneath one paw. But after that first contact, he didn't touch bottom for several more feet. By the time he waded out of the river, Xander felt like he'd fought in 5 kickboxing matches without getting a rest. He hadn't been this soggy since he'd fallen in the Puget Sound. At least this water didn't smell as dirty as that had. With his last ounce of energy, he shook the horrible water out of his fur, then he flopped down in a dry spot and considered his alternatives. By the time the tips of his fur were dry, he'd concluded that the river was at least 4 times wider than the trees were tall, therefore his only way across the expanse of water was to either locate a kite so he could sail over or find a bridge. Since the former seemed unlikely, and because he knew it was impossible to swim across the horrid stream, he headed north to find the bridge his map had shown. At least the events of the day hadn't been witnessed by anyone. By the time he fought his way through the dense undergrowth, it was nearly noon, but at least the rain had stopped. He leapt onto the road, grateful that his fur could finally dry in the open air. Then he studied the metal bridge that looked a lot like what he'd seen kids build with Tinker toys, except this thing was metal and had pavement, which shimmied and shook every time a car passed over it and shuddered like a quake when a bus or truck went over. Still, it offered a dry way across the darned river. He gauged the traffic, then sprinted during a lull, reaching the far side moments before a truck laden with green orbs thundered across. He sat down, exhausted. Hikes up into the forests are usually very rugged, river crossing, machete-wielding, trailblazing affairs, a familiar voice said. He turned to face Sharky, who looked positively prim, dry and smug. How did you find me? She looked at him, as if he'd asked the stupidest question on earth, and recalling the lack of roads, the river's current and the rugged terrain, it probably was the dumbest thing he ever had asked. Forget I asked that. What do you know about this area? This area is Jamaica's last remaining rainforest where many rare and exotic plants can be found as well as the world's second largest butterfly. Thank you for sharing that with me. This eastern face of the Blue Mountains receives more than 300 inches of rain each year, providing water for almost one-half of Jamaica's population, she said. Did you memorize the country's data? Yes. Her nose darkened. He paused to look at her. Why? Because I learned useful stuff. He perked his ears, encouraging her to go on. She took the hint and added, like at Ginger House there is a pretty waterfall beside a cave and a mineral spring. A swinging bridge connects Ginger House to Cornwall Barracks. She grinned. I've never had a dog chase me across it. And they say we are afraid of water. Now that was interesting. Where's Ginger House? Near the marina. You'll have to show it to me when we return. She looked pleased. How much farther is it to the coffee plantation? Days by foot, maybe even weeks. But if we climb on top of the bridge and wait for just the right moment, we might be able to get there in a couple hours. He studied the rusted girders. You aren't talking about flying a kite there, are you? She snickered and shook her head. I was afraid of that. Look at it this way, you won't have to try to swim across the river again, and your fur will get blown dry. I'll look like a puffball, he said, as he wondered how she'd known his fur was wet from swimming, not just the rain. You'll look handsome, just like always. She tilted her head. Ready to climb? While I was waiting for you, I found a good place to wait for the perfect truck. After the tree root and being saturated, the last thing on earth he wanted to do was climb an old rattletrap of a bridge just so he could leap off it and hopefully land on something survivable. Of course, he was not about to admit that to her. What are we waiting for? He leapt to his feet and pranced a few steps. Lead on. She checked for traffic, then sprinted toward the bridge, leapt high, landing on an angled girder and without pausing, dashed the rest of the way to the top. She hopped sideways, then stopped and looked back, apparently expecting him to be right on her pretty black tail. Amazing, he muttered. Not to be outclassed, he copied her moves. When he was in midair, leaping toward the girder, the air felt suddenly hotter, and when his paws hit the old metal his pads burned like he'd hopped onto a stove, something he'd done once and vowed never to repeat. He clenched his jaw, focusing on balance and speed instead of his aching paws, and arrived on top of the structure in one flick of a tail. Since Sharky had moved, he also copied her side jump, which landed him on a shady, cooler section of metal. Careful not to let his tail drape over the sunny area, he tried to appear casual and cool as if he was primarily interested in checking out the view. We need to be over here. She pointed at a wide, shaded girder on the other side of the bridge, but instead of moving, began licking her toasted toes. Since that was precisely where he thought he should be and she was doing what he wanted to do, he joined her. How do you find this spot? Did what you taught me, climbed the trees and surveyed the area while I looked for something that could help us. You knew I'd come here. Only after Hector said your attempt to swim across the river failed. She turned toward him, her eyes huge with admiration. Did you really do that, or was he telling me a whopper? Who is Hector? A heron I know. Xander thought back to his miserable misadventure. Blue, just a little taller than we are, skinny legs and neck. She nodded. And he's one of your spies. He couldn't have been more impressed. So you really, truly dove into the river and you know how to swim. Living on a boat, it seemed wise to learn. Suddenly, the entire bridge started to shake. What in Hather, he spotted a decrepit bus rumbling across the bridge, its once yellow paint faded and marred with rust and dents. Sharky stood up. Please tell me you don't plan to ride on top of that. The roof looks like we'd crash straight through. Worse, the metal top was probably scalding hot. Nope. I'm waiting for a produce truck, but my balance isn't as good as yours, so it's easier to stand up when things shake. She wrinkled her nose. Preferably not pineapples or oranges, but we might not have a choice. He raised a brow. She sighed. The produce truck will have a load. Pineapples are pokey and their leaves are sharp as kitten claws. Her nose turned dark pink. She was the blushingest gal he'd ever known. Last time I jumped an orange load it wasn't pretty. Rolled on you, did they? Gaze downcast, she nodded. Worse things have happened to me. And more recently than he cared to admit. Lest he say more than he intended, he settled to soothing his aching paws. Hopefully, he wouldn't end up with blisters on his pads. After he'd done all he could, he worked on his claws, which were gummy with tree sap and grimy with caked mud. He should have ripped the bark off the disgusting tree for its insolence. His claws might not be in any better condition, but he'd certainly feel better. He peeked at Sharky, who was also tending to her paws. Perhaps she was trying to impress him. If so, she was doing a darned good job of it. Imagine having a heron for a spy and not even being the island's protector. He peered at her, again. She hadn't been listed in his files, which wasn't unheard of, but a gal with her skills should have been listed somewhere. Perhaps Jamaica had lousy records. Or maybe the locals merely rated their cats by a different set of standards. He squinted at the clean claws on his left paw, then started manicuring the ones on his right. If Jamaican cats valued unusual skills, it would explain how Simon had been voted into office and why Sharky frequently acted like she thought she was inferior. Another set of values would even explain why the local cats had allowed the dogs to take over Port Antonio. Of course, if she was a spy for the dogs, that could also explain why she had drafted birds to answer to her. Worse, she would have had an opportunity to send information back to anyone she was associated with. This port was turning into more of a problem than he would ever have believed possible. He finished his right paw and started cleaning mud and tree sap from his belly. Gradually, his thoughts calmed and the peace of being in a lovely shaded area, smelling the sweet scent of flowers brought by the gentle breeze and listening to the soft coo of birds while cleaning his pelt put him into a zen state. I think this one will do, Sharky called while he spruced up the fur on his left side. Her tail twitched with excitement as she assumed the pounce posture and waited for the vehicle to pass beneath. Grooming forgotten, he got into position beside her and timed the leap to land on the fluffy green heap in the back. The moment the truck cab rumbled past, he and Sharky jumped with the precision humans generally attributed to the Blue Angel airplanes. The smell hit a moment before they landed and he knew they'd made a mistake, but the only thing he had time to do was modify which feet he landed on. Even so, his rear paws sank through the topping of lettuce leaves and grass into the rotten fish beneath. The full force of the stench hit his nose a moment before he sensed something icky oozing between his freshly manicured toes. Sharky landed up to her belly, sending a shower of the rather awful mess over him. I think we've found something worse than pineapples or oranges. It was difficult to speak while trying to hold his breath. Eyes watering, she merely nodded. He tilted an ear. It might be better over there on those big leaves. At least they would be closer to the cab and presumably the motion of the truck could keep the worst of the smell behind them. Gingerly he extracted one paw, then took a tentative step. He didn't sink in as deep as he had with the added velocity of his leap. Carefully, he took one more step then another and another until he was on the relatively stable pile of foliage. He put his nose around the cab and inhaled deeply, then, feeling fortified, turned back to Sharky, who had barely managed to move a third of the way. Need help? He asked, though he didn't have a clue what he could possibly do to assist her. She shook her head and determinedly took another step. Darned if she didn't act like a protector. By the time she joined him, Xander had scraped most of the vile fish slime onto the huge leaves and was trying to figure out how to groom himself without actually licking his fur or worse, losing his kibble at the idea. When she finally staggered onto the leaves, Sharky's nose looked white as the clean parts of her fur. You'll feel better if you let the wind blow in your face for a while. She put her chin on the rail and closed her eyes. Her sides shuddered as she inhaled. Xander settled next to her, glad for the excuse to stick his nose back in the fresh breeze, while appearing companionable. Feel better? He asked. Her grunt could mean anything. Pretty country, he said. Sharky turned her head and stared at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Don't pretend to be nice to me. I know this mess is my fault. Cuss me out, throw me off the truck, do whatever, just quit being such a gentleman. She turned away, but not before he saw a tear trickle down her cheek. What kind of background must she have to say such a thing? He scratched his ear before he recalled how filthy his rear paws still were. Hastily, he settled back down next to her. No one has ever accused me of being a gentleman before. He scanned the rutted road ahead, then looked up at the sky. Not a rain cloud in sight, and for once in his life, he would have welcomed a good shower. You couldn't have known this truck was loaded with garbage, and you certainly didn't push me off the bridge. She started crying in earnest. Want to tell me about it? Sharky shook her head. Patience being one of his strengths, Xander stayed quiet. After a long while she said, when I was a baby, my humans got rid of me. It took all his willpower to appear relaxed, after all her story wasn't unique. He'd see free kittens signs at every port of call. I lived in the animal shelter for 2 weeks, then got lucky and was adopted. Her nose curled with disdain. Xander clamped his jaws shut to keep the questions inside, some deep part of him knowing that if he asked them, instead of let her tell her story in her own way, she'd keep it buried. As soon as I was old enough, they stuck needles in me. Fresh tears flowed. That happens to a lot of us. The comment popped out before he could stop it. You, too? He nodded. Whenever I hear the word vet or see it written on the calendar, I disappear for a couple days. Heather only knew what new torment the villainous veterinarian would perform the next time one of the sadists got him in their clutches. How many of his friends were missing claws? According to his files, even Simon was missing the ones on his front paws. And hadn't he met at least 2 cats, who were missing their tails? They hadn't been Manx, either. Humans often did insanely evil things to their owners in the name of fashion. Thankfully, the worst of the butchery seemed to happen to dogs, who frequently ended up with cropped tails, shortened ears, and designer clothing. His whiskers twitched. What? Sharky asked, remembering a Doberman I once knew, and had performed a nose-ectomy on. She looked at him expectantly. Last time I saw Conan, a couple kids were pulling him down the sidewalk in their red wagon. He beamed at the memory of the tormentor of cats wearing a flowery, ruffled dress complete with matching vintage sunbonnet, which did little to hide his scared face. You broke his legs? She looked at him as if he was the greatest cat on earth. I wish. He paused to watch movement in the road ahead of them. Those don't move like cats or dogs. They're mongooses. She had to be kidding. I thought those lived in India. They probably do, but they're here, too. The good thing is that I haven't seen a snake since I came to this island. He looked at the frolicking trio with renewed interest. Abruptly, one stiffened and looked down the road toward their truck. A moment later, all of them dashed into the underbrush. They move a lot like cats. It's unusual to see them out during the daytime. Sharky thought for a moment, the misery of her fur temporarily forgotten. I haven't seen many in town, either. Ah, nocturnal forest dwellers. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with their obvious agility and joie de vivre, either. He wondered how mongooses, or were they called mongoose, felt about canines. If the dogs harassed them as badly as cats, they could be potential allies. As the old truck lumbered past the still undulating undergrowth, he studied where the mongooses had vanished, but couldn't catch a glimpse of them. Their coloring is so similar to his own that they were probably naturals at concealment. Perhaps they're even some form of distant relatives. His whiskers twitched with the possibilities. What? Sharky demanded. You sure do ask a lot of questions. Jaw tight, she turned away from him. He immediately felt bad, so added, Look, I'm sorry, I just have a lot on my mind right now. And I don't? He looked at her slimy fur out of the corner of his eye and wished his wasn't in equally bad shape. Xander inhaled. It was the worst thing he could have done. Eyes watering, lungs burning, he plunged his face back into the wind. So, you are a feline, instead of some super android cat, she said, her posture relaxing. I was beginning to wonder. He gasped for air until he felt safe trying to speak. Why? Her tail made a nervous twitch. Lots of stuff. He looked at her through a shimmering layer. Okay, your eyes for starters. She took a quick breath. I've never ever seen any other cat with blue eyes. In fact, the only places I've ever seen that color in nature is in about 12 feet of Bahamian water or a Carolina blue sky. It's just not natural. Where had she been that she'd never seen another Siamese before? And how did she know that Bahamian water changed shade due to the depth? Obviously there was a lot more to Sharky than his computer had revealed. When were you in the Carolinas? Never. Then how do you know the sky there is the same color as some Bahamian water? I've seen photographs, she snapped. So have I, but I never realized the colors were the same. I have an eye for color, obviously, and the ability was quite unexpected in such a cute black and white package. She went on, most cats do not have eyes the color of water. Her eyes narrowed to slits of gold. And they do not swim. If you say so. He studied her angry posture, which seemed disproportionate to the topic. If they were going to work together on this case, he needed to know exactly who she was and what made her tick. So, you've been to the Bahamas, probably arrived on a boat, since you seem totally comfortable with whispering wind's rocking motion, and you never learned how to swim. Very, very interesting, particularly coming from a girl who tells me her name is Sharkbait. He gave her his most sympathetic look. Want to tell me about it? No. She turned her back to him and probably would have given a good performance of an outraged female if the truck hadn't suddenly made a sharp right turn and thrown her against him. His claws sank into the Franz fibrous shank as he held on for them both. A moment later, the truck straightened itself out, its tires grinding up a steep, rocky incline. Sharky righted herself and peered ahead to see where they were going, just as the truck's brakes squealed and the driver jerked the wheel to the right. It bounced off the road, she said, as if the problem wouldn't have been obvious to the dumbest dog. But I don't think it's going terribly far, there's no road ahead. The gears ground out an awful high-pitched note. A moment later, the truck lurched to a stop in front of a shabby shed, the crooked door burst open and two scantily clothed brown children burst squealing from the dark interior. Guess they figure if they make a big enough fuss with their welcome, their parents won't get mad about them playing in the tool shed. The dirt-smeared tykes waved, their thin arms like twigs sticking out of their tattered clothing. Xander looked from the children to the smiling couple getting out of the truck to the garbage beneath his paws. You don't suppose they brought this mess home to eat, do you? The children got so close he could see yellow snot dripping out of the smaller child's nose. A shiver ran down his spine at the thought of the nasty germs the humans and the rubbish might contain. We gotta get out of here without being seen. Without waiting for her reply, he leapt over the back of the truck. He'd never landed on such steep terrain. Unable to secure any paws, he landed hard on his tail, then slid downhill amid an increasing cloud of dust and cascade of small rocks. Sharp things bruised his tail, but he didn't manage to stop his momentum until he splattered against a basketball-size rock. As Sharky plunged past him, he grabbed the scruff of her neck. Thanks, she gasped. She lay flat on the ground at his feet, either afraid to move or too stunned to budge. You think they saw us? Would it matter if they did? She blinked, as if surprised by his comeback. I didn't see any dogs. There are other enemies besides dogs. Yeah, the germs the little one had, come to mind. I really can't afford to be sick right now. He studied her expression, baffled at why she seemed so angry, when his stomach was the one crushed against the rock, and sitting on a tail that was one huge aching carpet burn. What's black and white and red all over? He asked to take his mind off his pain. Her scowl deepened. You covered with clay dust. He grinned at his own joke. Ha ha, very funny. You're a veritable Rolando. Sarcasm dripped through her disparaging tone. You don't like his brand of comedy? She snorted. He looked around for an escape route, short of falling off the hillside. There wasn't an obvious option. He'd landed near a sturdy tree trunk. He studied its relatively smooth bark. Looks okay for climbing, but could he even stand up after the fall? There was only one way to find out. He looked farther upward into the low branches, which were armed with thick, sharp thorns. Climbing this tree with its big glob-like fruit would be a last resort. He looked back toward the humans, but they were walking toward the shed, so he continued his visual reconnaissance. If he hadn't slammed into the rock, he would have plummeted into the road. Xander's ears perked with interest at his suddenly expanding prospects. Again, he studied the tree's limbs, concentrating on the side jutting over the road. If nothing had been broken, sprained or maimed, his plan was possible. The only problem was that he could neither hear nor see a single vehicle on the road. Sharky said, "Do you think this smell will wash off?" She was staring at a glimmer between the trees on the far side of the road. Obviously, the map hadn't lied when it showed the road following the river until it was high in the mountains. There's only one way to find out. Carefully he stood up and tested each limb as he gauged the leap onto the aged asphalt. "You're serious?" As a dead fish, specifically the one whose decomposing slime gummed his fur. "Come on." Everything except his poor tail seemed intact and soaking that in cool water would feel good. He leapt, landing safely on the warm, broken asphalt. There, he turned back waiting for her. Sharky fidgeted. "It's easier than climbing that bridge and jumping off it. For one thing, you know where you're going to land and it's not burning hot." She hesitated. "Now," he bellowed. She jumped. If circumstances forced him into the water twice in one day, he certainly didn't want to waste time contemplating the miserable prospect. He wanted it behind him and to be at a point when he could clean his poor fur, brush it and get groomed. He determinedly stalked across the road, then went down the steep bank on the other side without pausing. Fortunately, it wasn't as steep as the previous one, so he stomped across the sand straight into the water. He only stopped to examine his poor abused tail when he felt water rushing across his stomach. Xander stood in the disgusting water, hoping it would wash away the revolting slime and blood, while numbing the gravel burn enough so he could retain his dignity in front of Sharky. There was a faint splash behind him. "I cannot believe I'm doing this," she said. Careful of the slippery rocks beneath his paws, he turned to her. "You only have to get the slimy parts." "But the goose splattered everywhere," she wailed. Xander narrowed his gaze, grateful for any distraction from his own sorry situation. "There are only a few gunky places on your side and back." Tears welled in her eyes, but she laid down in the water. "Will this really clean off the mess?" "Heather, but I hope so." Sharky moaned and turned her head away. Ripples expanded around her on the smooth surface of the water as she shuddered. "I know it feels icky, but it's certainly better than worrying about getting asphyxiated breathing the stench or worse, having to lick off." He dunked his head in the water and trembled at the thought of licking off his feet. Stomach controlled for the moment, Xander resurfaced. The poor girl looked like her dignity was propped on her last nerve. Since he didn't know what he could say that would make her feel better, and he didn't want to look at his tail quite yet, he focused his attention on his rendezvous with Simon and what was turning into a rather forsaken place to meet. His only solace was the thought that if the section of road from Kingston was anything like what they'd been over, Simon wouldn't have a pleasant journey, either. Xander wished he could use his collar to shoot off a quick email, but knew better than to operate it in water. Xander raised his right paw and studied his soggy fur. Was it his imagination or had the slow current washed away some of the mess? Ripples still encircled Sharky's violently shaking body. "How you doing? Fish are eating me." This he had to see. Careful, so he wouldn't spook them, he went to her and peered into the water. A school of thin silvery fish no bigger than his paw clustered around the spots where he'd noticed globs of gunk, their tiny jaws working frantically. "I've heard of cleaner fish, but never seen them before." "They aren't cleaner fish, bait fish, maybe." How would she know? Well, perhaps they aren't a normal cleaner fish, but that's what they're doing. He peered through the clear water. They're pretty good at it, too. Just try to stand still. She clamped her eyes shut. Jaw trembling just above the water, she tried to stay still, but the more she fought her fear, the worse she shook. If Sharky didn't manage to control her emotions, she could become the one cat source of a tsunami in this river. A few tiny fish moved toward him. Tiny jaws pulled at his fur. Something nibbled the tender flesh of his backside. Xander started purring his favorite lullaby. Memories of his mother's beautiful voice and lavender-flecked eyes washed over him. The moment he was dry, he'd send her a cyber card. He should do so more frequently than when the human calendar reminded him. Fortunately, since his mother was pedigreed, he had dozens of siblings, so she probably didn't miss hearing from him. You're right, they're cleaning the gook and leaving my fur and claws alone. Sharky stared intently into the water. I wonder what fish spit tastes like. Anything has to be better than what that slimy crap smelled like. It's a wonder I didn't asphyxiate the moment the stench hit my nose. By then, it was too late to avoid the mess. He nodded. I really am sorry. I know it's totally my fault. She looked ready to drown herself. Worse things have happened, he said philosophically. The look she gave him shouted liar. Xander sighed. Yes, we're trashed, but it's for a good cause and fur does wash. He scowled. You must promise me that you will never tell anyone that I voluntarily walked into this river. Or dove into it earlier? He felt his frown deepen. You certainly do have an interesting spy network set up. Her eyes widened with surprise. Jorge is just someone I talk to. Right. Hadn't she said her bird informant's name was Hector? And hadn't she referred to the seagull who had monitored his arrival as Julio? How many of your friends happen to have wings? Her gaze dropped, confirming his suspicion. Good story, but we all know that birds are only good for two things and information gathering is the use I like least. He licked his lips at the memory of the roast chicken they'd shared. Suddenly, it seemed like years since he'd eaten. He looked up as one of the odd blue birds flew over, skeletal legs trailing behind. His stomach growled. I have it on good authority that herons are mostly feather and bone. She held her chin high above the water, looking oddly dignified despite her body being submerged and surrounded by tiny feasting fish. Jorge's authority? How do you know? He smiled at her naivety. Her gaze narrowed. Oh, well, nobody eats them, not even humans. It was simply a passing thought, but we should find something to eat, keep our strength up for the trip and all that. His stomach growled again. Did you see any chickens at that shack? She shrugged. We need to check it out. Where there are chickens, there are generally eggs, good eating and great for a shiny coat. He rippled his silken fur, then seeing Sharky's morose expression, felt bad about forgetting her miserable state. As he tried to think of something nice to say, something bit him. Ouch, he howled as he leapt into attack pose. You okay? He nodded. Though he looked for his attacker, none was evident. Still, he knew the phantom menace was close because he was missing a chunk of fur from his rear right leg. He studied the area, finally noticing a rock that wasn't a rock. Heather, why did you sick that turtle on me? How have I displeased you? Watch out for turtles, they eat fur. Sharky leapt straight up at least 5 feet high, then shot sideways and landed on the bank. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have thought the jump was possible, particularly from a prone position and saturated with water. Imagine what that cute little gal could do if she were dry. Giving the turtle a wide berth, he walked out of the water. Where do you train? Nowhere. I hope you don't expect me to believe that after the jump I just witnessed. He shook as much water as possible from his fur, so did Sharky, who actually managed to look cute with everything but the top of her head saturated. He glanced down at his sodden legs, which looked positively ridiculous. It's the truth. Xander rolled his eyes upward, but was too busy with his fur to argue. It is, she insisted. If you must know, I lived on a Grand Banks. It's a kind of powerboat. He paused with his grooming. I've seen a few, but what does that have to do with how you learned to jump like that? Well, I had to. The girl wasn't making a lick of sense, even though she was making startling progress on her fur. He stared at her until she paused to add, I enjoyed dinghy bouncing when I was a kitten. She acted like that explained it all. He gestured with his tail for her to explain. Dinghy bouncing is when your humans have at least 2 inflatable dinghies or at least there are 2 tied side by side to your boat. He gestured for her to continue. Inflatable dinghies are nice and bouncy, like really cool big balls, but you know all about that because I saw that you have one. Did you know that you can walk on them without them rolling over? Never tried, he admitted. Well, you can, and if you're good, you can bounce between 2 of them. It can be a challenge to time the jumps with the waves and stuff. Before he could request that she continue, again, she turned away from him and began to furiously clean her fur. Several things were very clear to Xander. 1. Sharky had been very good at the game. 2. She didn't like to talk about it, which meant that somehow bad memories were associated. 3. That game sounded like it would be an excellent way to get exercise while living aboard Whispering Winds, and Heather knew how difficult it was to keep his skills honed when he couldn't get to land. He needed to motivate his humans to get a second dinghy.